Schaefer also did things like he took out ads in pornographic magazines, pretending to be a woman, and started letter writing campaigns with people. He also, under this false idea, he would write letters to other murderers and rapists in prison to be a woman and engage in these lengthy fictional letter writing relationships, I guess you could call them, with them. And he also he wrote editorial boards of newspapers around Florida. He wrote the Florida state attorney's office, and he was constantly writing. And so many of his writings are so similar to these letters, or this one letter that Ottis Toole, who was completely illiterate, supposedly sent to John Walsh. And the two definitely knew each other. Gerard John Schaefer claimed to be Ottis Toole's prison attorney, although he was not an attorney. And there's just a million different factors pointing to the fact that Gerard John Schaefer wrote this letter to John Walsh saying, "I'm Ottis Toole and I killed your son." And so it kind of makes sense to me that the emotional level of reacting to a letter like that would be so convincing that later facts would not necessarily change his mind. But I don't know that for sure. That's my best guess as to why John Walsh has continued all of these years to say that it was Ottis Toole who murdered his son, despite overwhelming evidence that Toole did not murder Adam Walsh.
What do you think would motivate Toole to confess to the Adam Walsh murder?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's the thing. Actually, I can answer that a couple of different ways, and I'll try and be succinct with this first part of it. Toole started to confess to anything that police detectives brought before him. And so, when I'm writing about someone, when I'm writing a book about someone especially, I try to kind of get to know that person, even if that person is, deceased, which is the case with Ottis Toole. And, the sense that I get of Ottis Toole, and based in all of the evidence, really, is that this is someone who was never treated well all his life. He was abused physically in any possible way you can imagine from the time he was very young. And he had an IQ of about 75. He, like I said, was almost completely illiterate. And he liked to set fires in these beautiful historic homes in Jacksonville. And when he went to jail for a manslaughter from someone who died in one of these fires, he started to confess to anything that police brought before him. So that's kind of the larger issue, that he made up stories. He had a talent for, I think, telling what people wanted from him and then giving them that. And they wanted confessions, and he gave them. I said I was going to be succinct. That was not succinct. The more particular answer is that, Ottis Toole, neither Lucas nor Toole were particularly bright individuals, but Lucas was the dominant personality. The two, they had a long-term, whatever you want to call it, love relationship, sexual relationship. And Toole really constantly sought Lucas's affirmation. And he said, however, he said at first that Henry Lee Lucas was with him when Toole abducted Adam Walsh from Hollywood, Florida. When he found out that, in fact, Lucas was in prison elsewhere, he had to change the story. And so he said, no, it was just him. And so the initial reason seems to be two things, because he was confessing to all sorts of things, and that made him important for the first time in his life. But secondly, he was angry at Henry Lee Lucas at this particular moment because Lucas had run off with Ottis Toole's niece, Becky Powell, and in fact probably murdered her. And he was Toole was angry with Lucas at this point and said he wanted to hang this on him. He said it repeatedly. When he confessed, however, he had watched the made-for-TV movie about Adam Walsh's killing in his jail cell the night before. He still managed to get every single detail wrong. And if you read the actual transcriptions, and I have them in Stalking Ottis Toole, and I will quote from them in my book that'll be out next year too. And there are also some, I have them on my website as well. If you read the actual transcriptions, the police are constantly telling him, you got that fact wrong. And then they'll say things like, are you sure about that? Are you sure it wasn't such and such? And then Toole would change his answer. And one of the homicide detectives from Jacksonville, a guy named Buddy Terry, was actually removed from the case. He had been interrogating Toole, and Buddy Terry had told Ottis Toole that the two of them could have a book deal together. And again, that made Ottis Toole feel, important. I mean, sadly, it made him feel like a badass for the first time in his life. And Terry was removed from the case. But Toole recanted multiple times. His confessions of murdering Adam Walsh they contradict each other every step of the way, and yet that is still pinned on him. All of these years later.
Now, Henry Lee Lucas confirmed his story, though. He said he was in possession of the head. What would motivate him to go along with this and make this story up?
I don't trust anything that Lucas said any more than anything that Toole said, quite frankly. Okay. So I don't really take Lucas at his word any more than I take Toole at his word. But they also, interestingly, they paid attention to the news when they were both in jail. Toole in Florida, Lucas in Texas, and they kind of, in some ways, competed against each other. They would, by how many murders they would come up with and what lurid details they would come up with. And there are actually these recordings, the two of them speaking on the phone to each other while they're in jail, and you can look at the transcripts, which again I have these in my book as well. You can look at these transcripts and see how Ottis would say something, but then he would kind of question Lucas and say, not explicitly, but kind of question Lucas as to whether that was true. And if Lucas didn't like the thing Toole had just said, he would kind of guide him to saying something slightly different. So they had this kind of competitive thing, but Lucas was dominant personality whenever they were together.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, a couple of questions. Now, you're not convinced that Toole was a serial killer, but he did have many of the indicators, right? The starting fires, early childhood sexual abuse, but you're only convinced of one murder?
Yes, and I'm not convinced that was not intentional. It was arson. Toole was good at two things. He was good at setting buildings on fire, and he was good at telling what people wanted and then giving them the story they wanted to hear.
What about Henry Lee Lucas? Was he a serial killer?
In the first place, I don't know as much about Lucas as I do Toole. What I do know about Lucas is basically through Toole. So because Ottis Toole is the one that I've always focused on. But I do think that Lucas murdered a few people, including Ottis Toole's niece, whose name was Frida Powell. She went by Becky. And And probably also his own mother. But again, I'm not. I feel certain of everything that I say about Ottis Toole because I've worked it so much, and I feel a little less certain. I feel like really Lucas is tangential for me to Ottis Toole.
Now, because I'm definitely no expert on this whatsoever. I couldn't even pronounce the name before I mentioned it. Okay, so we're not going to rely on me.
Most people. Yeah. Most people see it, and they've heard the name Otis, and it has two T's, so it looks like Ottis, but nobody's ever heard the name Ottis, right? Yeah. So most people do call him Otis Toole at first.
Yeah, like we said, because of Otis Campbell from the Mayberry, and also the Otis elevator. Right. But now, from my outsider perspective on this, and I'm certainly no expert, I had always assumed that Toole and Lucas were like best buddies and traveled together for years and years and years. What was the nature of their relationship?
Yeah, I think their relationship is really interesting. They met in Jacksonville. They met at a soup kitchen, believe it or not, on Valentine's Day, 1976. I think that. I can't speak for Lucas, but I think that Ottis Toole actually loved Henry Lee Lucas. They had a, I don't know that you would call it romantic, but they had a love relationship. They certainly had a sexual relationship, and they did travel around a lot. There is this pretty fascinating psychological phenomenon called a folie à deux, which is a kind of a delusion that is shared by two people, and usually the dominant personality in that relationship is the person who kind of influences the delusion most, and the other person is more passive to it. And in that case, Ottis Toole was definitely more passive than Henry Lee Lucas. I think he looked up to him. I think he needed his affirmation. And, when the two are together or in discussion together, as they were with these taped phone calls when Toole was in prison in Florida and Lucas was in prison in Texas, you can hear Ottis's need for Lucas to affirm him constantly, and really Ottis Toole always, even when he was saying the most despicable things you could imagine, he always had this little boy quality to him, which I think is especially, it's almost a sling blade kind of situation. Although I think Ottis Toole was sweet generous. I think he's his own thing, so I don't want to stamp him that way. But there's something really incongruous about the fact that he could talk about cannibalism and devil worship, and always kind of sounded like a lost little boy at the same time.
Well, could that possibly be because when he was exposed to that kind of activity, he was a little boy? Wasn't his grandmother a Satanist? I don't think that there's any truth to any of the devil worship stuff whatsoever. He was, absolutely, he was sexually abused from the time that he was very young, sexually abused by a family friend and possibly by his father. He, as these stories gained a life of their own, and he started confessing to everything, and detectives took them all around the country and gave him cigarettes and sandwiches, and he got his name in the papers, and he was an important killer. He got better and better at embellishing these stories. So he said despicable things. He said that he, roasted children on kebabs and ate them, and that someone was going to publish his cannibal cookbook. He said that his grandmother had been a Satanist and used to dig up bodies and all sorts of things. And quite frankly, people love to hear that stuff. And Ottis Toole was very good at figuring out what people wanted from him and giving them exactly what they wanted, because that is what had been done to him, through all the kinds of abuse that had been foisted on him since he was very young. Now, Henry Lee Lucas also had these similar stories of satanic cults and stuff like that. Were they making these claims before they met each other, or this happened after they met each other?
So and again, let me start off by saying